Welcome to Life Stories. Today, we bring you the powerful journey of Nora, a woman who gave everything for her family only to find herself overlooked and taken for granted. From the weight of her father's illness to the betrayal by her brother, Nora's story is one of sacrifice, resilience, and the ultimate decision to break free. Join us as we explore her path toward self-discovery, independence, and the lessons learned through hardship. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to begin today's story and stay tuned for more inspiring tales. Nora's life had always been one of quiet dedication, woven with a sense of duty that defined her every decision. From the outside, her family looked like any other: two parents, two children, a home filled with the quiet hum of everyday life. But behind the doors of their modest house in Chicago, there was tension that cut deeper than anyone outside could understand. Nora was the quiet one, the one who stayed home, who kept the house running when everyone else had other things to do. Her older brother, Ryan, had long been the family's golden child. With his fancy degree from Harvard and a high-paying job in finance, he seemed to glide through life with ease. He was the pride of their parents, the one who was always told how smart, capable, and successful he was. And then there was Jessica, his wife, a woman who played the part of the perfect partner: gracious, supportive, always looking poised. On the surface, she seemed to fit seamlessly into their life. But underneath the surface, she and Ryan were a force that often added more weight to Nora's already burdened shoulders. While Ryan lived in a city far away, leading a life of what seemed like effortless success, Nora remained at home, juggling the responsibilities of caring for their ailing father. It wasn't just physical care, it was financial too. Nora was the one who managed the household expenses, making sure everything was running smoothly. She cooked meals, tended to her father's health needs, and still somehow found time to study, all while Ryan and Jessica remained disconnected from the realities of what was truly happening in their family's home. Their mother, though loving, had always shown an overwhelming preference for Ryan. It wasn't a secret. She'd never shy away from making it known. Nora had often overheard her mother speaking wistfully about how life with Ryan and Jessica seemed so much better, how she wished she could live with them instead. To hear those words was like a blade to Nora's heart. For years, she had been the one shouldering the weight. And yet, no one seemed to recognize the sacrifices she made, big or small. Her mother's words stung more than they ever could have imagined. Even though Nora kept the family afloat emotionally and financially, she always seemed to be the one who was invisible. The quiet daughter who was too busy managing the household to ever stand out. She was the one who gave and gave, with no acknowledgement, no applause. And when she did get a word of recognition, it was rarely from her mother, who was often too absorbed in her adoration for Ryan. But through all of it, Nora had learned something powerful. Strength didn't come from being praised or acknowledged, it came from the ability to keep going. Even when no one saw, it came from the deep reservoir of empathy that she felt for her father, for the family, and for the love she still held despite everything. Then life took another turn. Nora was in her second year of university when the unthinkable happened. Her father, who had always been a pillar in their family, fell seriously ill. It wasn't sudden, it was a slow decline that took everyone by surprise. At first, it was manageable. But as his condition worsened, it became clear that Nora's mother could not care for him alone. Their mother, who had always been more absorbed in her own life, found herself helpless and overwhelmed. And so, Nora, once again, stepped in. There were days when Nora had to rush between lectures and home to help her father with his medications, to make sure he was comfortable. Her university studies were pushed aside as the responsibilities of caregiving became her priority. But even in those difficult moments, she never let her father see her distress. She kept a calm exterior, knowing that her father needed her to be strong. He had always been her rock, and now it was her turn to be his. But as she found herself juggling school, caregiving, and keeping the house in order. A thought lingered in the back of her mind: how could she continue to care for him once she graduated and started her career? The future felt uncertain, and the burden felt heavier by the day. So, Nora began to explore alternatives. She took a deep dive into studying business models online, learning concepts that were entirely new to her. She began applying what she learned in her economics classes and, slowly, she built something from nothing: an online business. It wasn't easy, but she had no choice but to make it work. As she balanced her newfound business with caring for her father, something unexpected happened. She started making enough money to contribute more significantly to the family's finances. She could finally see the fruits of her labor. And though no one else seemed to notice, her father did. One day, as she helped him with his medication, he looked at her with a soft smile. "You've sacrificed so much for this family," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You've grown into a responsible, hardworking woman. I'm proud of you." Those words, simple as they were, cut through all the years of unnoticed sacrifice. Nora's heart swelled with emotion. She had spent so long being invisible, always giving and never asking for anything in return. But her father, in that one moment, had seen her, and for the first time, she felt that her efforts, her quiet love for her family, had been truly recognized. That, in itself, was a victory. As Nora's father's health continued to deteriorate, the strain on the family only deepened. She was doing everything she could, managing the household, taking care of her father, and running her online business, but it often felt like it was never enough. In the midst of it all, Ryan, her brother, had become more and more distant. Despite all the years of care that Nora had given to their family, Ryan remained unreachable, almost detached from the realities of their daily struggles. He was living his own life far away in the city, and his occasional phone calls were more out of obligation than any genuine interest in the well-being of his family. Ryan's silence was deafening. It was as though he had chosen to ignore their situation, leaving Nora to pick up the pieces. Their father, who had been his greatest supporter, had made countless sacrifices to ensure that Ryan had the opportunities he needed to succeed. Yet, in Ryan's eyes, these sacrifices seemed to fade into the background, overshadowed by his own ambition and success. For Nora, this abandonment felt like a betrayal, one that added to the already overwhelming pressure she was under. There were nights when Nora would lie awake, wondering what had gone wrong. What had happened to the bond they once shared as children? How could Ryan, who had been her closest confidant growing up, turn his back on the family in such a way? She tried to make sense of it, but the answers never came. Instead, she focused on the task at hand, ensuring that her father was comfortable, that the house was in order, and that her mother was cared for. But it was clear that, no matter how hard she tried, Nora was always the one left holding everything together, while Ryan pursued his dreams without a second thought to the family that had raised him. Then, as if to add insult to injury, Ryan made an unexpected return to their lives. It was after their father's health had taken a turn for the worse, and the family was once again forced to confront their fragile reality. But Ryan didn't come back to offer help or support. Instead, his sudden reappearance was marked by a request that would stun anyone. He asked for $99,000 as a wedding gift. Nora was stunned. The audacity of his request left her speechless. How could he, after years of silence, come back and demand such an amount? The money wasn't just a sum, it symbolized everything that had been wrong with their family dynamics: the selfishness, the disregard for the sacrifices Nora had made, and the lack of gratitude from Ryan. Nora's father, hearing this request, was visibly shaken. He had always been proud of Ryan's achievements. But now, in his time of need, Ryan's absence had been made even more glaring. Her father's frustration and sadness were palpable as he asked, "Why should we give him anything? He abandoned us. Never once checked in. And now, After all this time, he expects us to fund his wedding? Nora's heart ached. She had always known her father's pride in Ryan. But this request, this blatant disregard for the family's struggles, cut deeper than anything she had ever experienced. And yet, despite her father's pain, her mother, ever the dutiful mother, tried to justify Ryan's request. It's a parent's duty to help their children start a new life, she argued. But her father would not have it. He was no longer willing to turn a blind eye to Ryan's behavior. Nora has been here every day, supporting this family, he said firmly, while Ryan vanished without a word. And now he wants money he doesn't deserve. The argument that followed was heated, filled with years of frustration, disappointment, and unresolved anger. Nora had never seen her father so openly disillusioned with Ryan, and it shook her to her core. For the first time, her father acknowledged her sacrifices not just as a daughter but as the pillar that had held their family together in his absence. It was a rare moment of validation, one that Nora had longed for but never expected to come. Yet, as the argument unfolded, it became clear that Ryan's priorities lay elsewhere. His focus was not on family, not on the bond they shared, but on his own desires and ambitions. He had abandoned them when they needed him most. And now, in his time of need, he sought to take advantage of their vulnerabilities. The emotional toll of it all was profound, and it left Nora wondering if the family she had worked so hard to keep together was truly worth saving. When their father passed away, the weight of the situation only grew heavier. Nora had been by his side throughout his illness, had held his hand in his final moments. But when it came time to mourn, she was once again left to carry the burden alone. Her mother, in her usual detached way, seemed almost indifferent to the loss, more concerned with making arrangements than with mourning the death of her husband. And then, as if to add insult to injury, Ryan and Jessica arrived at the funeral. Their presence was not one of mourning but one of entitlement. They were dressed inappropriately for the occasion, their behavior disrespectful and out of place. And yet, their arrival didn't seem to faze Nora's mother. In fact, she greeted them with a smile, as if nothing was amiss. "Now we can discuss your father's inheritance," she said, her voice unusually bright in the midst of their grief. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and Nora could feel the tension rising. This was not the time or the place for such a discussion. But Ryan, emboldened by his mother's support, wasted no time in making his claim. "Honestly, I don't think Nora should expect anything," he said, his words dripping with sarcasm. "She's been living off Dad all this time." Nora was stunned. The accusation stung. But she didn't let it show. Instead, she stood firm, refusing to let him turn her father's funeral into another opportunity for his self-serving agenda. This was not about inheritance, it was about honoring the memory of a man who had loved them both, who had worked tirelessly to provide for them. But for Ryan and Jessica, it seemed that nothing mattered except what they could get for themselves. And so, as the funeral continued, Nora was left to confront the painful truth: her family had fractured beyond repair. The bond they once shared had been replaced with bitterness, resentment, and a profound lack of empathy. And despite everything she had done for them, it was clear that she would never be able to bridge the gap that now lay between them. After the funeral, the days that followed were filled with a strange sense of emptiness. Nora had lost her father, the one person who had truly seen her and understood the depth of her sacrifices. Her mother, still distant and absorbed in her own world, had left her to handle all the funeral arrangements, a final testament to how little she appreciated Nora's efforts. Ryan, despite his earlier display of entitlement, had disappeared once more, leaving only a trail of selfishness and unresolved tension behind him. But in the midst of her grief, something within Nora began to shift. She had spent so many years giving, sacrificing everything for the family, yet had been left behind when it mattered most. The realization struck her like a sudden storm: the family she had worked so hard to support had failed her at every turn. Ryan's actions, her mother's indifference, and the constant strain of living in a toxic environment had worn her down. But now, in the wake of her father's death, Nora saw things clearly for the first time. For years, Nora had been the silent force that held everything together. But she had done so at the expense of her own dreams and aspirations. Now, with her father gone, she no longer had to carry that weight. For the first time in her life, she realized that she was not obligated to put everyone else's needs above her own. She had spent so many years being invisible in the eyes of her family. But she knew now that it was time to make herself visible in her own life. That decision, to break free, came suddenly, like a breath of fresh air after a long period of suffocation. She knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance. Of course. Particularly from her mother and Ryan, who had always taken her for granted. But Nora was done. She had given them everything. And in return, they had abandoned her, taken her for granted, and made her feel invisible. Now, it was her turn to live for herself. Her first step was to confront the issue of the house that had once been the center of so much pain and sacrifice. Nora had always assumed that her father's property would remain with the family. But in a quiet moment, shortly before his passing, her father had made a decision that changed everything. He had transferred ownership of the house to Nora. He had seen the sacrifices she had made, the years of her life she had devoted to the family, and he had trusted her to care for it. When she told her mother and Ryan about the transfer, they were stunned. Ryan, in particular, was furious. He couldn't understand how his father could have made such a decision. His entitlement, which had been so apparent in the days leading up to the funeral, flared up once again. "This isn't fair," he shouted. "I'm the eldest son. I deserve this house." Nora stood her ground. Despite the wave of anger that surged within her, she had heard Ryan's selfish demands for years. But this time, she wasn't going to let him push her around. "No, Ryan," she replied calmly, her voice steady. "This house doesn't belong to you. It's mine. Dad entrusted it to me because I've been the one here, taking care of him. You weren't here. You don't get to claim it just because of your birthright." The argument that followed was fierce. Ryan was relentless, insisting that as the eldest son, he had every right to the house. But Nora, for the first time in her life, didn't back down. She had finally realized that this was not just a house, it was a symbol of her father's trust in her, of all the sacrifices she had made for the family, and of the life she had built for herself in the face of overwhelming adversity. Her mother, as always, tried to intervene, suggesting that they share the house, that they all divide the property as a family. But Nora was resolute. She had given enough. She had done more than anyone could have asked. And now it was time to reclaim her life. "No, Mom," she said firmly. "Dad wanted me to have this house because he trusted me. You and Ryan have shown nothing but selfishness. I won't let you take advantage of me anymore." Nora had reached her breaking point. The years of emotional neglect, the unacknowledged sacrifices, and the constant betrayal had finally taken their toll. She was done with the family's toxic hold over her life. She was ready to move on, to live a life where she could be seen for who she truly was, not just as the caretaker or the invisible daughter, but as someone who had her own dreams, her own desires, and her own path to follow. And so, with a heavy heart, but a clear sense of purpose, Nora made her decision. She would sell the house. She would leave. There was nothing left for her here, not the family she had fought so hard for, nor the home that had become a symbol of her years of sacrifice. The house was the last tie that bound her to this place, to this family. And once it was gone, she would be free. The decision wasn't easy. Nora knew that it would break her mother's heart, and that Ryan would never understand. But for the first time in her life, Nora knew she was making the right choice. She was reclaiming her life, taking control of her future, and leaving behind the toxic environment that had held her back for so long. The house was sold. And with the money in her hands, Nora made plans to leave. She booked a flight to California, to a new beginning, where she could finally start living for herself. It was a place she had always dreamed of, sunny, peaceful, and filled with endless possibilities. As she packed her things, she felt a mixture of sadness and liberation. She would miss her father, of course, but she was done with the pain of being taken for granted, of being invisible in her own family. It was time for Nora to step into the light, to create a life that was truly her own. Her journey was just beginning, and this time, it was a journey for herself. As Nora settled into her new life in California, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of relief. The years of sacrifice, the pain of being overlooked, and the betrayal of her own family were all behind her now. With the salty breeze of the ocean in the air and the golden sunsets painting the sky, she found a peace that had long eluded her. Her online business flourished, and for the first time, she could truly focus on her own growth. Nora had learned that her worth was not defined by the expectations others placed upon her. She was more than just a caretaker or an invisible daughter. She was an independent woman, capable of creating her own path. Though her heart still ached for the family she had left behind, she knew that her decision to walk away had been the right one. The bond she had tried to hold together had been fractured beyond repair, and it was time for her to live for herself. Nora had learned that love and empathy were important, but so was setting boundaries and prioritizing her own happiness. Nora's journey had not been easy, but it had taught her resilience, self-worth, and the importance of embracing change. As she looked out at the horizon, a future full of endless possibilities stretched before her. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. Thank you for following Nora's story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to stay updated on more inspiring life stories.